If I didn't have this badge, would I still be here? Late at night, the air remained stifling, still carrying the scent of hot asphalt and freshly cut grass. Under the flickering streetlights, shadows stretched long across the quiet streets of Maple Avenue. Jamal Henderson sighed, his fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel of his black Chevrolet Impala. It had been a long day, 12 grueling hours of paperwork, endless meetings, and the bureaucratic headaches that came with the job. As the head of internal affairs, Jamal no longer patrolled the streets like he used to. His role now was to oversee other officers, ensuring they upheld their duties. But right now, work was the last thing on his mind. He was thinking about the cold beer waiting in his fridge, the jazz playlist already queued up, and the simple pleasure of sinking into his couch. Just 3 more blocks to go. Then, flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. Jamal's grip on the steering wheel tightened instinctively. No siren, just the blinding glow of the lights. He knew what this was. Not the first time, probably not the last. Stay calm, follow procedure, hands on the wheel, interior lights on, window down, and wait. The patrol car doors slammed shut, the sound cutting through the stillness of the night. Heavy footsteps struck the pavement. Under the glare of the headlights, a tall figure emerged, moving closer with rigid authority. Ryan Calloway, around 35, sharp features, neatly trimmed hair, the solid build of someone who spent more time in the gym than reading up on legal codes. His uniform fit snugly over broad shoulders. His duty belt weighed down with weapons and tactical gear. Everything about him radiated confidence, but not the confidence of a man who knew the law. The confidence of someone who believed he was always in control. He approached the driver's side window. No greeting, no explanation. License and registration. Jamal kept both hands on the wheel. His expression unreadable. He had seen this before. Investigated cases just like this. He knew Calloway had made up his mind the moment he saw him. Still, he asked, his voice steady, "May I know the reason I'm being stopped?" Calloway narrowed his eyes, his displeasure evident, his tone sharpened. "Papers." Now, Jamal met his gaze. For a brief moment, the air between them felt heavier. The world around them pressing in. 2 men on opposite sides of the law, except one of them knew exactly how this game was played. Calloway's gaze swept over the car's interior, his eyes scanning Jamal with the quick, practiced assessment of someone searching for something, anything, suspicious. This wasn't the look of an officer conducting a routine traffic stop. This was the look of a man who had already made up his mind and was just waiting for a reason to prove himself right. He jerked his chin toward Jamal, his voice still cold, but this time, there was a trace of contempt beneath the words. "There've been a lot of car thefts around here lately. And I don't recognize you in this neighborhood." Jamal almost laughed to himself. 3 more houses. That was all. 8 years living here, and he knew every street, every house, every neighbor. He'd shared barbecue meals with them, helped clear their yards, waved good morning as he jogged past. But to Calloway, he was still just some stranger in a car that, by his standards, didn't belong in this neighborhood. Jamal studied the officer's face, noting the tension behind his eyes. Not the kind of wariness reserved for a criminal. The kind reserved for someone who, in his mind, simply didn't fit. "You don't recognize me?" Jamal thought. "Or you don't want to?" Calloway stepped closer, resting a hand on the car door. His stance wasn't just authoritative, it was possessive. An assertion of control. "Step out of the vehicle." Now, Jamal took a slow, deep breath. He knew this game, and if he wasn't careful, he knew exactly how it could end. Jamal sat still for a moment. His eyes met Calloway's, not defiant, but unwavering. He had seen this scenario play out too many times. In reports, in testimonies, in investigations. He had read about men ordered out of their cars just like this. Men who never got the chance to question or explain. Some were lucky enough to walk away with just a warning. Others never walked away at all. He took a slow breath. No sudden moves. Every decision had to be precise. Deliberately, he unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements intentional, controlled. Everything needed to be clear, nothing abrupt. Nothing that could give Calloway an excuse to feel threatened. The door opened. As his feet met the pavement, Calloway's gaze sharpened. His hand hovered near his holster. Jamal straightened, hands relaxed at his sides, no pockets. No unnecessary movement. His voice was steady, low but firm. "You sure you want to do this?" For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Calloway's face. Hesitation. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by that same smug confidence. "I'm following protocol." Calloway shrugged, a smirk curling at the corner of his lips. "If you've got nothing to hide, then you've got nothing to worry about." Jamal pressed his lips together. A cold ripple ran down his spine. He had dealt with officers like Calloway before, men who believed the badge on their chest made them untouchable. But this time, Calloway had made a mistake. Without haste, without sudden motion, Jamal reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Under the glow of the streetlights, he flipped it open, revealing the gleaming badge inside. Head of Internal Affairs. And in that instant, Calloway froze. The smug grin vanished. The air thickened in an instant. Under the flickering streetlights, Jamal saw the exact moment realization hit Calloway like a brutal punch. The officer blinked, staring at the badge in Jamal's hand as if willing it out of existence. His mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. The arrogance, the control he had just wielded, it all vanished in a single breath. Jamal remained still, saying nothing. He wanted Calloway to sit with it, to feel it. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds stretched into an eternity. Calloway swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. He squinted slightly, scrambling to regain his composure. His voice stiff and awkward as he forced out a response. "I was just doing my job. There was a report of suspicious activity." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious activity?" Calloway nodded too quickly, latching onto the excuse like it could save him. "Yeah, a lot of car thefts in the area, and I saw your vehicle." Jamal exhaled softly through his nose, tilting his head just slightly, as if weighing the words. Then, he spoke, quiet, almost a whisper, but sharp enough to cut. "Say it straight. It's because I don't look like I belong here, isn't it?" Calloway's face tensed. He opened his mouth to argue. But then, he stopped. Because they both knew the truth. The space between them grew heavier, like someone had sucked all the oxygen out of it. Jamal didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply watched, waiting, and Calloway had nothing left to say. Calloway swallowed hard, his gaze flickering between the badge in Jamal's hand and the unreadable expression on his face. The balance of power had shifted. Jamal spoke slowly, each word forged from cold steel. "If I didn't have this badge, how do you think this would have ended?" Calloway didn't answer right away. The question hit like an open palm slap, forcing him to confront a truth he wasn't ready to admit. Jamal noticed the slight clench of Calloway's hand near his belt, not fear, but frustration. Frustration at being caught. Frustration at losing control. But there was nothing he could do. Because Jamal wasn't just some nameless man stopped in the middle of the night. He didn't need Calloway to say the answer out loud. He already knew it. Taking a slow breath, Jamal continued, "You made up your mind the second you saw me. Not because I did anything wrong. Not because I was suspicious. But because I didn't fit into what you think belongs in this neighborhood." Calloway's jaw tightened. His lips pressed into a thin line. Jamal stepped forward, not enough to threaten. Just enough to make sure Calloway felt every word. "And if I didn't have this badge, what then? Calloway? You gonna cuff me? Tear through my car? Or would it be something worse?" Calloway took a half step back. Not because Jamal had threatened him, but because he had no answer. He knew. Jamal knew. They both knew. For the first time tonight, Calloway was no longer in control. Calloway stood there, lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze shifting away, but Jamal could see the thoughts racing behind his eyes. He was searching for a way out. An excuse, a justification, a way to reclaim the control that had just slipped from his grasp. But there was none. Jamal let the silence stretch, forcing Calloway to sit with the truth he didn't want to face. Finally, Calloway drew in a deep breath, as if he had found his answer. His voice hardened, clinging to the last remnants of authority. "You didn't hand over your papers immediately. You asked questions. That's suspicious behavior." Jamal blinked slowly, studying him like he was examining a textbook case study. "I asked why I was pulled over. That's my legal right." Calloway said nothing. Jamal tilted his head slightly, his voice quiet but razor sharp. "You're saying I was in the wrong, because I didn't obey you without question?" Calloway clenched his jaw but didn't argue. Jamal exhaled a quiet, knowing breath. You know this was wrong. But instead of admitting it, you're trying to make it my fault. The silence that followed was louder than any excuse Calloway could have given. Jamal nodded slowly. You don't have a problem with how I reacted. You have a problem with the fact that I dared to react at all. Calloway's eyes flickered, his fingers twitching slightly at his side, not out of anger this time, but because he had just been seen. Calloway's lips pressed into a tight line, his jaw clenching as if holding something back. He wasn't used to this. Not used to being challenged. Not used to losing control. Jamal saw it all. He'd encountered plenty of cops like Calloway, men who didn't think they were biased but acted as though their authority should never be questioned. Men who didn't see themselves as the problem. Men who believed that simply saying, "I was just following protocol," would make everything go away. But this time, it wasn't going away. Calloway took a slow, deep breath, steadying himself, and then, as if on cue, he said exactly what Jamal expected, from the way he stood. The way he looked at him. The way he grasped at any justification he could find. You're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. Jamal let out a quiet chuckle, one without any humor. Am I? His voice remained calm, but something in his gaze made Calloway glance away. I was ordered out of my car because you didn't recognize me. I was questioned like a suspect when I did nothing wrong. And when I asked a simple question, why am I being stopped? That somehow became suspicious behavior. He stepped forward, not aggressively, but just enough to unsettle Calloway. So tell me, Calloway, in your mind, how should this have ended? Calloway opened his mouth, then closed it. Because he didn't have an answer. And they both knew why. Calloway remained still, saying nothing right away. The streetlight cast sharp angles on his face, exposing something different, no more confidence. No more absolute authority. He was calculating. Jamal saw it clearly. Calloway was trying to find a way to turn this around. To salvage control. Finally, he drew in a deep breath. His voice stiff, rehearsed. I was just doing my job. There've been car thefts in the area. I saw you driving slow through the neighborhood. And I followed protocol. Jamal gave a small, deliberate nod, as if turning the words over in his mind. Testing them. Protocol. He repeated the word, rolling it over like he was checking for cracks. Then his eyes sharpened. Let me ask you something. Calloway, if I didn't have this badge, do you think we'd still be having this conversation like this? Calloway didn't answer immediately. He could lie. He could say, of course, pretend as if everything about this interaction had been fair. But Jamal wouldn't believe him. And more importantly, Calloway wouldn't believe himself. His lips pressed together, his gaze flickering away. But the silence, that single hesitation, said everything. Jamal nodded slowly, like he'd just confirmed something he already knew. You don't have to say it. I already know the answer. Calloway swallowed hard, his gaze still darting away as if avoiding Jamal's eyes could somehow make this moment disappear. But Jamal wasn't letting him escape. You know who I am, don't you? Jamal's voice wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of stone. Calloway blinked, his fingers unconsciously tightening near his belt. Yeah, his voice was quieter now, less certain. Jamal tilted his head slightly, his stare cutting through Calloway like a scalpel, peeling back every layer of defense. Then say it. Calloway swallowed again. He knew what Jamal was doing, forcing him to admit the truth. The truth that Jamal wasn't just some random man on the street. The truth that he had stopped the wrong person, the worst person he could have stopped. Calloway inhaled deeply, then exhaled, his voice lower but clear. Head of Internal Affairs. Jamal nodded slowly. That's right. And what's my job, Calloway? Calloway didn't answer immediately, but Jamal didn't need him to. My job, Jamal said, voice even, steady, undeniable, is to investigate cops like you. Calloway's jaw clenched, a slight twitch in his cheek. Jamal didn't need to raise his voice. Didn't need to threaten. He simply was, the undeniable presence of a truth Calloway couldn't run from. Calloway took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but Jamal could see the cracks forming. Cops like Calloway were used to being in control, used to dictating how a situation unfolded. But now, he had no way out. And yet, instead of facing the truth, he did what Jamal had seen hundreds of times before. He tried to justify himself. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just following protocol. Jamal tilted his head slightly, his eyes sharp enough to cut. Protocol? He repeated the word, not loud, but weighted like a verdict. Calloway shrugged, grasping for some semblance of control. You didn't hand over your papers right away. You questioned me. You didn't comply immediately. That's why Why you what? Jamal interrupted, stepping just a little closer. Would you have cuffed me? Would you have searched me? Or maybe, his voice dropped lower, quieter, but somehow heavier than any shout, would it have been worse? Calloway said nothing, because they both knew the answer. Jamal nodded once, slowly, as if sealing an unspoken truth. I'll ask you one last time. Calloway, if I didn't have this badge, how would this have ended? Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening. His eyes refused to meet Jamal's. But his silence said everything. A week passed, then a month. Ryan Calloway sat in a training room, surrounded by people he had never imagined himself having to listen to. People who had been pulled over for no reason. People who had been treated like criminals because of their appearance, their skin color, the way they dressed. He sat in silence. He didn't argue, not because he didn't want to, but because, for the first time, he realized he didn't know enough to speak. It wasn't easy. Each story he heard was like a blade cutting into his pride, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had never questioned. He wanted to push back, wanted to say, I'm not like the bad cops. But then he remembered that night. Remembered the way Jamal Henderson had looked at him. Remembered the final question. If I didn't have this badge, how would this have ended? And he knew he hadn't been able to answer. Blank. Blank. One late afternoon, in the parking lot of the precinct, Calloway saw Jamal heading to his car. A part of him wanted to keep walking, to let it go, but then, against every instinct, he called out, Chief Henderson. Jamal turned, his expression unreadable, not angry, not forgiving, just watching. Calloway swallowed, then spoke, carefully. I just wanted to say, thank you. Jamal studied him for a long moment. Then he gave a small, measured nod, replying with a simple but weighty statement. We'll see if you actually change. Then he opened his car door, started the engine, and drove away. Calloway stood there, watching the taillights fade into the distance. And for the first time in his life, he understood, change wasn't about words. It was about what came next. And he had a long road ahead to prove it.